this is kind of the main thing that we're focusing on when we talk about reducing the weight of a karmic action, is to help purify that action so it doesn't lead to its full consequences. That it can either lead to something much milder, or if done powerfully enough, that we don't have to experience the negative consequence at all. Okay. So that's how it relates to the title. Reducing the weight of negative karma involves, one way or another, the practice of purification. And there are different practices of purification. And among them are meditations on Shakyamuni Buddha and Vajrasattva, two in particular that are used for this. And the material here has been abstracted from those practices. And but the aspect of it that I want to concentrate here are how to apply those four opponent powers, because it's said that true purification takes place not so much by following any one ritual or any one series of practices, but whether or not those four opponent powers are applied. If they're applied, purification will happen. If they're not, even if we go through the motions, it's very doubtful that any significant purification will be the result. Okay. So these four are taught in different orders, depending on the teacher and the circumstance. And in this particular case, the names and the order in which they'll be explained is as follows. And you can start, if you want to kind of see where they're written, it starts on page 5. So the first two opponent powers in this particular version of the practice are explained together, and that's the powers of regret and resolve. Regret and resolve. Okay. In many explanations, these two are explained separately, and resolve is put towards the end. In this particular practice, regret and resolve are put together at the beginning. So there are different ways of ordering this. It's not like one is right and the other is wrong. There's just different approaches we can follow. So those are the first two of the powers. Of course, right now I'm just giving their names. Explanation will follow. Okay. The third is the power of reliance. And then the fourth, somewhere on the next page, bottom of 7, is the power of the remedy. And of course, these four are not always known as regret, resolve, reliance, and remedy. Sometimes they're known by different names. But the value for this one is that as long as you remember that each one begins with the letter R, there's a good chance you'll remember what they are. Okay? But sometimes they're referred to by different titles. Okay. And as it says right under that, in terms of the practice, bring to mind the unskillful actions of body, speech, and mind you wish to purify. So this means that if you have in your memory an experience of having engaged in an action which, according to the laws of karma, is going to lead to a negative result, it was a harmful action that you engaged in. If it's something that you remember, then that might be something you specifically want to purify. To give a personal example, I'm not at all happy to have to admit this, but when I was a kid, I killed a lot of insects in not very nice ways. It was a game. I didn't have anger or hatred to them, but I didn't really take into account that they were sentient beings who wanted to be happy and didn't want to suffer. So I just killed a lot. So when I started to study Buddhism and heard about the purification practice, I realized, oh, there's something that I remember having done a lot of. So I had something very specific, and I worked on that for a long period of time. Okay. So there may be something in your past, not such a long time ago, that you've forgotten about it, but something that whose memory you're living with. That might be one of the things that you want to focus on. There also can be the case where in this present life we're experiencing some significant hardship, a physical ailment, or repeated psychological problems, or constant dreams of violence, right? Well, from the karmic point of view, all of these can be the consequences of actions which, even though we don't remember, we must have committed, otherwise we wouldn't be experiencing these harmful results. Now, of course, to think that way, we have to have some reliance that the teachings on karmic cause and effect are true, and that the description that the enlightened beings give as to what kind of actions produce what kind of results is valid. If we don't have that sense, then this presentation isn't significant for us. But if we come to understand that there is this direct relationship between the harm we're experiencing now and the actions which we must have engaged in as that were the cause of these, then we can focus on purifying actions. Even though we don't remember them, we can logically assume we must have committed them, or we wouldn't be experiencing these consequences. Okay. And I just want to pause into the explanation for a second to relate a story that a friend of mine told. He experienced very, very frequent, very, very severe headaches. And I was very sympathetic to that myself, because for many, many, many years, from childhood on, I also experienced headaches, but not as severe as the ones he described. Very debilitating, very sharp pains. And on one occasion, he received some help by a person who was quite skillful in, I guess, what you would call a past life regressions. He was able to bring people back step by step until they had access to things that happened even before this lifetime. And he had a very powerful experience in this, It was a very powerful vision of a reality that he hadn't ever seen before, and it struck him as being very, very true. And in this experience, he saw that he had stabbed someone in the temple, in the head, like that. And he saw it as vividly as we're seeing each other, right? It was very convincing to him. And so after that, after he kind of came back into the present life, he engaged in purification practices specifically about that, which included such things as asking for forgiveness of what he had done. And these headaches, which had been with him for his entire life, stopped. Right? So we can't necessarily take one testimony of one person, especially someone that none of you know, just a friend of mine, and base an entire philosophy just on that. But this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, that if we can either figure out logically what we must have done, or have it pointed out to us through a clairvoyant means of one sort or another what it is, or simply rely on the Buddha's teachings, because in his teachings he does describe the connection between suffering that we're experiencing now and specific actions that would have been the cause of it, or could have been the cause of it. Right? So through any of those means, we can start seeing a connection between cause and effect, even if we don't have the clear, unobstructed vision to know exactly which cause produced exactly which result. We can still get a general idea. And then we can engage in the purification practices in relationship to those actions, even though we don't have a clear memory in this life of the action that we're purifying. Okay, so there's different ways in which we can come to know which action that we'll focus on to purify. So that's why it says here, bring to mind the unskillful actions of body, speech, and mind you wish to purify. It could be any of those approaches. Okay, something we quite clearly remember, or something we can logically assume from our experience that we must have done. Okay. So just reading, just a few sentences under that. You may think of specific actions you remember having committed, or you may refer to a general list, such as the 10 non-virtuous actions, such as the ones I mentioned before, and so forth. Recognizing the harm that such actions have caused, and will continue to cause if left unpurified, cultivate a strong feeling of regret, but not guilt, for having committed them, as you would regret having mistakenly swallowed poison. This does require commentary. Within this context, cultivating the power of regret is very positive. Cultivating guilt is completely unnecessary and irrelevant. And yet, for many of us, there's no difference between the two. Right? So, I remember being present when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was addressing the difference between regret and guilt. And it was within a very interesting context because an American nun, a great teacher in her own right, was explaining to His Holiness and to the assembled Westerners and Tibetans who were present how in her experience so many of the Western people she knew were filled with a sense of self-loathing and guilt. So many people carried that. And His Holiness expressed great surprise at that. And after the explanation was given of what this self-loathing or guilt was like, he asked the other Westerners present, that description, does that relate to something in your psychology? You know, do you relate to that? And all the Westerners raised their hand. Then he addressed the Tibetans in the room and he says, does that make sense to you? Is that part of your background? And none of them raised their hand. So there was a real difference between the pervasiveness of this kind of guilty conscience, which seems so strong. I mean, when I grew up, I thought it was Jewish guilt. Then later, my friend said, no, it's not Jewish guilt, it's Catholic guilt. And then my Protestant friend said, no, it's actually Protestant guilt. You know? So each group thinks that they have, it's from their own cultural background or religious background that this deep installation of guilt or self-loathing comes from. So I think it's just pervasive in our culture. No matter whether we have a religious background or not, we kind of imbibe that in general, you know, a feeling of kind of worthlessness and like that. This is not nearly as pervasive in other cultures as it is in ours, apparently. That's not to say that they don't engage in negative actions, but that feeling of worthlessness doesn't seem to be nearly as strong or pervasive. So the Dalai Lama was really quite amazed, and then over a period of time, in subsequent teachings that he would give, he would address this, because now it had come to his attention how pervasive this was. This wasn't just something that one or two people felt. Many people felt it among his Western audiences. So I do remember at one point he was asked, then what is the difference between regret as a positive quality, something to be cultivated, and guilt as a negative, unnecessary quality, which has no relevance here? And he said, guilt is an attitude that traps you in the past. Regret is an attitude in which you can take responsibility for your future. And on thinking about it, I thought, well, that's like His Holiness, taking a very, very complex psychological symptom, reducing it to a few words, and really nailing it right on the head. You know, so in our guilty feelings, when we kind of lashing ourselves, I'm such a bad person, what we're often doing is we're remembering something that we might have done or said or thought, which is an indication that deep down we're rotten. Right? So bad action, whether actually done or just imagined, it equals being a bad person. Okay? So there's this strong identity of badness. That's quite different from remembering that we may have engaged in an action which was harmful. You know? Engaging in an action which is harmful can be a very accurate description of what actually happened. But then to make the jump that because we engage in something bad, we ourselves are fundamentally bad, means that we're frozen on something in the past. In fact, maybe not even something in our own personal past, but in our kind of cultural past. That could be the case, you know. And then we're holding on to that as some fundamental aspect of our identity. Now, if people who have received teachings on the ultimate nature of reality, or the true nature of the self, and so forth, realize that one of the the fundamental cause for suffering is holding on to such concrete, unchanging identities. You know, identifying in that fashion as if those actions, those attitudes, were actually the definition of who and what we were. Okay? So guilt and that kind of self-flagellation is, as His Holiness said, being caught in a past and bringing it to the present as if it were our solid underlying identity. Okay? So not only is it not helpful, but it itself is a symptom of the cause of all of our suffering. Right? That kind of grasping onto identities, grasping onto self-nature in that respect. That's a big topic, but just a few words about it. Okay. Now regret, however, is something different. And the example that's used here is regret similar as you would regret having mistakenly followed poison. Mistakenly, did I say followed? Yeah. Swallowed poison. You have to pay close attention to what I'm saying, not because it's so brilliant, because every once in a while I'll just completely say the wrong word.
Well, we know what you're saying.
Thank God. Thank God. Because I'm not sure I always do. So, this is an example that was very helpful to me when I first heard my teachers mention it. The example, the situation was as follows. 3 friends go to eat in a new restaurant, and they order the same dish. And after a short while of, starting to eat their meal, first one and then the second of them fall to the floor with incredible stomach pains, quite clearly experiencing food poisoning. Right? Think of the situation of the third person. Right? My 2 friends who ate the same meal that I've been eating have contracted food poisoning. If you were that person, would you feel guilty for having ordered the same thing or regret having ordered the same thing? There'd be no reason to feel guilty. But you certainly would feel regret. You said, I was thinking of ordering something else. I wish I had. Because the chance that I'm going to also be experiencing this result is very high. I don't have any special immunity, and my friends are experiencing the suffering. So the regret, instead of freezing you in the past, would motivate you to do something about it. So, like, you might call over the manager and ask if they have a stomach pump or an antidote or where's the nearest hospital. In other words, you would be motivated by your regret for having eaten that food. You know, it's like His Holiness says, it's aimed towards the future, to doing something about it, before you actually are coming down with the sickness that struck your friends, like that. Now, a person who has an extremely strong guilt complex, you know, maybe he was brought up by a Jewish mother and a Catholic father and a Protestant aunt or something like that. So he's really got 3 doses of it, you know. Someone who really has it in spades, you know, this strong feeling. He could develop guilt for having ordered it, you know, right? It's because I'm such a bad person that I made this mistake of ordering this food. So, yeah, strike me down, you stomach bug. I deserve it because I'm such a bad person. But most of us would laugh at that. And that really seems irrelevant. But there are people whose guilt is so strong that they will project that feeling onto any situation. You know that example that I used before of caution or even fear, like sticking your finger into a flame because it burns, that's kind of reasonable. Well, someone with a very, very strong sense of personal guilt might feel the reason they were burnt by the candle flame was because they were being punished for being a bad person. Not the simple physics that if you put your hand in a flame, if you have a certain kind of flesh and the flame has a certain kind of power, burning is a natural result. It has nothing to do with rewards or punishment. That's just the nature of these elements, right? But someone with a really strong, strong guilt complex will even take that sense of a guilty identity and project it onto a situation where it has no place. Okay. So, why am I going to such depth on this one? Is because the power of regret is really fundamental. We really have to get a sense that the action was harmful, and that if left unpurified will lead to a negative result. So we have to cultivate the attitude of wishing to be rid, or at least modify, the negative result of harmful actions that we can remember, or harmful actions that we can infer that we must have committed for various logical reasons, or because it's stated in certain teachings. Okay? Now, this regret, as I mentioned, is often spoken of separately from resolve. But in this abbreviated practice, they're mentioned together. The resolve, what that comes down to, is the resolution not to commit that same action again. Okay. So, as I indicated, in some presentations of these 4 powers, 3 of them are mentioned first, and then at the conclusion of the purification, then that's when the resolve comes in. You know, having applied the other powers, then at the conclusion you have the resolve not to do it again. But here, they're presented together. So you regret having done it, and you resolve not to do it again. Now here, again, in terms of resolve, there's 2 ways that I've heard my various teachers present it. One, which personally I find the most comfortable, is sometimes there's actions that are in our history that we've done and that we regret, and we can have full confidence that we can avoid doing it again. So then we can make a resolution, I will not commit that kind of action again. I'll never order that dish in the restaurant again. I'll never do that one again. And we can have confidence that, that we can avoid it. There are other actions which seem to be so deeply ingrained, have such a habit to it, that if we say, I'll never do it again, we might be fooling ourselves. Right? Because sooner or later, the habit is so strong that despite the resolution, there's a really good chance it'll rise again, just because of the strength of the habit, the strength of the conditioning. In that case, according to this first type of explanation, it's probably better to make the resolution, I will avoid this action for a specific amount of time. So if you can avoid it for a month, then that's the resolution you make in your own mind. I will avoid committing the same type of action, the same kind of action that I regret having done. I'll avoid it for a month, or a week, or a day, or for a few minutes, or at least a few seconds. In other words, you choose a period of time which seems reasonable in relationship to however strong or habitual that action was to begin with. And that is an explanation that I've heard a number of times, and one of the reasons it's given is that therefore we avoid the problem of having made a kind of a promise to ourselves that we then break. Right? I'll never do that again, and then a day later we do it again, and now we have something else to purify. We not only have to purify the action, but the broken vow not to do it again. So that explanation that I heard, was kind of comfortable for my mind. But a very short time ago, I met someone who was attending teachings by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he said, in his opinion, it was actually stronger to make the vow when we remember an action that we regret and that we want to avoid doing again, to make that vow kind of forever. I'll never do it again. That has a certain psychological strength of the resolution. And then, of course, if we transgress it because of the force of habit, well, that's not the end of the world, because we have methods for purifying. So he was suggesting, and I didn't hear this directly from him, but my friend is a very valid source of information. She said, according to the Dalai Lama's explanation, it makes sense to make a particularly strong resolution even if you don't live up to it. That by making strong resolutions like that, eventually we do reach a point where we can avoid repeating those actions, even the very strongly habitual ones. So I'm kind of offering both, because I've had very great teachers tell me both approaches. So I think it's reasonable that we use the approach that seems that the best for our own psychology, realizing we might change after a while. We might find one teaching more appropriate at one point in our development, and another teaching more appropriate at another point. And that's true for many of the Dharma teachings. You know, the great teachers have taught a whole variety of techniques. Those of you who study Shantideva, and his 6th chapter, he talks about all the various techniques for overcoming anger, and he gives a whole shopping list of different techniques, from the very, very profound to the very, very simple and mundane. And each of those techniques has a value, and the value depends on which ones we can actually practice. It's better to practice a simple mundane technique that's not nearly as profound as, another one, because we can actually do that one, and the profound one is beyond our scope at the moment. So we do what we can with the intention, at a later time maybe I'll be able to apply even the more powerful, even the more profound technique. And so that we could apply that same kind of approach here. Okay. The next one. before I continue, what's the connection between regret and resolve and those other factors that we touched on previously under Roman numeral 4 about the factors that determine the weight of the practice, the weight of the karmic action, right? Regret and resolve. Well, if we remember something harmful that we did, and I'll use an example of that's a more common everyday example than something as violent as killing, harsh language. Where I grew up near New York City, it was a sport to rank people out, to insult them. It was a style, it was kind of a game. And that can build up a habit in which harsh language, putting people down, becomes so ingrained that it starts becoming second nature. And you can actually take pride. Oh, that was a good zinger. I really got that person. Sometimes we wait. Maybe we were insulted once, and we think, oh, next time I see this guy, I'm going to really hit him where it hurts, And so we build up this strong feeling, and then when we come out with that zinger, we're really proud of it. I did a good job. I really got him, But what we did, in fact, was very insulting. Maybe we thought it was a game, but it really could have hurt somebody's feelings. Words do have a very, very cutting effect, as the old saying goes, So, actually the old saying has it backwards. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. That's completely not true. Names hurt people terribly. And, this is something this is a soapbox I shouldn't get on, but the way people talk to children can have terrible effects because they internalize those messages. You're so stupid, you're so ugly, you're so this, you're so that. It can warp the whole development of that kid's life, It's not necessarily tied together with physical violence, though of course that happens as well, but just the words themselves become internalized and become the basis of a really bad self-image, which then can have tremendously negative consequences on the growth of that child's mind. Well, that's true when you speak to a child, but to some extent that's true also when we insult other people, even grown-ups. It can really hurt. Right? So there's an attitude in which you recognize that kind of harsh language as something negative, something that first and foremost hurts others, but plants a karmic seed on our own consciousness so that in the future we become the recipient of that kind of insults. That might be the case when, let's say, there's a poor schmo who's always being insulted. And he wonders, why is everybody always speaking to me so roughly? Well, from the point of view of these teachings, this would be a karmic consequence of having engaged in harsh language sometime in the past. Maybe even so far in the past that we have no memory of it. But that would be the karmic reason that there are some people, a lot of other people enjoy insulting. Right? Why me? Why is everyone always insulting me? Well, from a karmic point of view, the answer would be, that sometime in the past, at a previous point in the evolution of that mental consciousness, as another being, but part of that same continuity, one has harmed others with violent speech, and now one is reaping the result of that violent speech. So not wanting to experience that anymore, then we could regret having engaged in that kind of speech and make the resolution not to do it again. The opposite of that is what I described before, that we use violent speech and then we are actually proud of it. Right? So there's a big difference between doing an action with the feeling that was really good, and if I get another chance, I'll do it again. Right? That's a very deeply ingrained karmic seed, isn't it? As opposed to having regret, in which, that was really not very skillful for me to engage in that harmful speech, and I'm going to make every effort from now on to avoid it. And if I can't completely avoid it, I'm going to try to avoid it as much as I can. So that has to do with, the idea of frequency, and also it can be conjoined with balancing it out with a positive action. So, for instance, if we have mindlessly or carelessly or maybe with some kind of malice insulted someone, well, one of the things that we could do is to really make a point to use very supportive, loving, affectionate language to that same person. Often together with an apology can go a long way. So these applications of regret and the opponent forces of the remedy and so forth can lessen the strength of the negative action. So it's not as if we notice we have this habit of harsh speech, that's the end of the story. No, the story isn't over until we apply something to change this end of that story. Okay. And then the resolve is, to avoid doing it again, rather than the sloppy attitude or the complacent attitude of, well, I did it, maybe it wasn't so good, but I'll probably do it again. In fact, I kind of enjoyed it, so I probably will do it again. Obviously, that attitude doesn't work as an opponent power. So the strength of that action remains quite heavy. Now, the third one in this list is the power of reliance. Okay. And what this comes down to is an analysis of who or what is it that we're transgressing when we engage in the negative action. What exactly is it? So you might think, well, it's obvious. If I hit someone, or insult someone, or lie to someone, those are all quite obviously negative actions, harmful actions. Then the object, the object of that non-virtue is the person that I've lied to or hit or like that. That seems quite obvious. That's not what this is referring to. This is referring to something deeper than that. Because these particular teachings of purifying the results of negative actions is something that's presented within the context of cultivating the supremely compassionate mind of bodhicitta. Okay? So what is this supremely compassionate mind of bodhicitta? And that's not an English word, but I think a lot of you have heard it already. Does anybody feel confident that they can give a short, accurate description or definition of what this bodhicitta attitude is? Anyone like to offer it? I don't want to embarrass anyone by pointing to you, but somebody might want to just feel enough confidence that you've heard the teachings enough that you feel you can repeat it. Anyone?
The wish to attain enlightenment, so that you could bring all sentient beings to enlightenment?
Yeah. Bodhicitta, bodhi is enlightenment, chitta is an attitude or a motivation or a wish. So it's the wish, the chitta, to attain bodhi, enlightenment, which is this state in which all aspects of impurity have been removed from the field of consciousness, and that the pure mind spontaneously develops all good qualities such as love, compassion, wisdom, and the skillful ability to help others. So anyone who has completely purified the mind of its defilements and has fully developed these good qualities, has attained Bodhi, enlightenment. In other words, you can be a Buddha without being a Buddhist. You know, you just have to engage in this cleansing and of negativities and cultivation of good qualities. That's what the word Buddha actually signifies. Okay? So the question is, well, why would be motivated to attain this state of full enlightenment, this state of Buddhahood, or whatever word you want to give to it, perfection, totality, fulfillment? Why do it? Well, the very minor answer to that is because it's groovy. You know, it's described as an incredibly blissful, unencumbered state of consciousness, right? That's not sufficient. That's not the motivation. The motivation is to help others. We want to help others, and we can help others to varying degrees at any stage of our existence. But compared to the kind of help that we can give when our mind is completely purified and completely developed, in other words, when we've attained this full enlightenment, the amount of help we can give now is very, very small indeed. It's still significant and is to be practiced, but if our compassionate intention to help others is strong enough, then we become motivated to elevate our existence beyond the ordinary level so that we can be of maximum benefit to others. You can think of an analogy. Let's say a good friend of yours is suffering from some disease. And you might wish, I wish I had the medical knowledge to be able to prescribe for this disease, but I don't. Right? But you could have a wish, I wish I could do that. Some people, based on that wish, actually become physicians or healers or like that. They even when they were young, they thought, I want to get this ability so I can be of maximum benefit to others. And that can motivate you to become a physician, a healer, a doctor, or any other profession that really helps. Well, this takes that wish, to its ultimate extreme. Not only just a profession, but a state of mind in which our ability to help others is unparalleled. Okay? So this wish, this bodhicitta, is this compassionate wish to be of maximum benefit to others by attaining this state of enlightenment. Okay? So at this point in the path where these things are talked about, and this power of purification, for example, especially let's say if it's within the context of a Guru Shakyamuni Buddha visualization, or even more so with Vajrasattva, these are major purification practices. All these practices are based on having the wish to develop the bodhicitta, to follow the bodhisattva way of life. Okay? So at some point, one either has explicitly or implicitly signed on to the Mahayana, the vehicle in which has its ultimate goal enlightenment for the sake of benefiting others. It's not just coming from any random place, it's coming from this strongly compassionate wish. Okay, now let's go back to the original situation. When I lie to someone, or hit someone, or use harsh language to someone, yes, that other person is the object against the negative action on one level, but on a deeper level, what has really been harmed is my bodhicitta motivation. Because my bodhicitta motivation says I'm working for the sake of others, and that action of lying, hitting, stealing, whatever it is, weakens the bodhicitta. It's the exact opposite. Through bodhicitta, you compassionately want to help people overcome their problems by lying, hitting, stealing, whatever the negative action is. You're weakening the service that you want to give to others. You can't simultaneously wish to help someone out of their suffering and at the same time add to their suffering. Right? Doesn't make sense. So yes, the other person on one very significant level is the object of your negative action, but it's that compassionate bodhicitta motivation which really suffers. It weakens that. So what one does then is regenerate the bodhicitta motivation. Remind oneself, since that motivation has weakened, then you rely on it by restrengthening it. You go through the various thought patterns which got you to that compassionate place to begin with. So most negative actions that we can think of have the compassionate bodhicitta motivation as their object from this point of view. But not all of them do. For example, the spiritual path is revealed to us through, from a Buddhist point of view, from Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Even if we're not particularly Buddhist, we have something in our life which may be equivalent to that, a source of direction, inspiration, and so forth. Right? So even though I'm describing it in Buddhist terms, it's completely applicable to people who have another religion or people who have no religion, but are somehow inspired to do good, to fulfill their human potential. Okay? So the fact that I use Buddhist terminology here isn't limiting, it's just a specific example for here, but we should be able to understand it in terms of what's really meaningful to us. If we haven't yet signed on to the Buddhist path, obviously we're interested in developing our mind. There must be some reason, there must be some inspiration. Okay? So some of the negative actions that we engage in can weaken the refuge we have in that source of inspiration, whether it's Buddhist or not. So, for example, a typical thing that happens is that in a Buddhist context, we have an altar, and we try to set up images of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and the gurus who represent them in a very nice way. We can, instead of relating to these symbols with great respect, we can relate to them in quite another way. Putting the pictures in a low and dirty place, not being careful, how we respect them and so forth. And even more so, we can act negatively to the actual beings that those pictures do represent. So for instance, we could speak in a harsh way to our guru, who is kind of for us the medium through which we really get to know what Buddha and Dharma and Sangha really mean. So any of those actions, the result of that is not so much that it weakens our bodhicitta, though that could possibly also be a result. But what the main thing it does is it weakens our refuge. These are objects which keep us aligned with the source of the spiritual path, and by showing respect either to the objects themselves or their symbolic representations, we're lessening the strength of our refuge. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, what the lamas often explain at this point, it's like getting up after falling down again. If we walk along and trip and we fall onto the ground, to stand up again, we have to push off against the ground. Right? So, in this analogy, the refuge and the bodhicitta are the grounds that we've fallen onto, right? It's what we've tripped onto, over. Now to get back up again, we strengthen, we revitalize our refuge and bodhicitta. And a very kind of simple way of doing that is like reciting the 4-line prayer that we did in the beginning. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, you know that prayer, right? But of course, just doing a ritual repetition of a prayer is not nearly as important as really thinking about why refuge is such a vital aspect of our spiritual development, and why the cultivation of the compassionate bodhicitta motivation is the only motivation that makes this life of ours truly worthwhile. So, reciting the prayer is secondary. If reciting the prayer reminds us of the meaning behind it, perfect. But if it's just a rote, recitation, our mouth is moving but our mind's not engaged, then it's like putting the car in neutral and gunning the gas, so you don't get anywhere. Okay. So that power of reliance is really to bring up, why is it that we take refuge in the first place? Why is it that we wish to cultivate compassion eventually up to the admiration for the bodhisattva way of life as manifesting through the bodhicitta motivation? Okay. And then the last one, the fourth one, which remember in other lists would be the third one. You'd have regret, then reliance, then this one, remedy, followed by the resolve at the end. But here now, this remedy is the last one in this list. And again, there are a whole range of remedies. Some that are very traditional, some that are very non-traditional. Traditionally, reciting a mantra and doing a practice that has a whole lineage of purification behind it, such as Vajrasattva or certain Guru Shakyamuni Buddha visualization practices. These are very, very well known remedies, and engage, as part of that practice, as part of the visualization, and as part of the mantra recitation, and so forth, one is invoking a very powerful opponent force. Okay. Then there are other opponent forces which are very non-traditional, but the guru can help direct a specific disciple to practice them, because the guru understands that this will be truly effective, even if it's not written in any text anywhere. And perhaps in Tibetan history, the best example of that is, do you know which example I'm going to use? Milarepa. I knew there'd be somebody here who would know it. Milarepa, one of, if not the most beloved saint practitioner in the whole history of Tibetan Buddhism, certainly among the most, right? And actually, in my experience, he's universally respected, And he started out, in fact, being responsible for the death of many people and even more animals. So, from one point of view, he was a murderer. He was directly responsible. Now, he did it because his mother wanted him to seek revenge on relatives who had stole their patrimony, and he did it by learning these black magic arts that caused a hailstorm to come down on a building in which all his relatives were gathered, and the building collapsed and killed all the people inside. So he was responsible for a tremendous amount of loss of life. And he was so filled with horror at what he had done that he resolved to find someone who could purify him of this. And he found the person who could do it. That was Marpa, often known as Marpa the translator, very, very important figure and the font of the Kargyu tradition, who made many trips to India to bring back sacred texts and translate them into Tibetan. But Marpa, oh boy, Marpa was a powerful guy. And he didn't handle Milarepa with kid gloves. He gave them really heavy purification practices, which are not written in any scripture. He had him build towers single-handedly, pull them down, build them again, pull them down, and build them again for the third time. Truly back-breaking work. And he did it in a way that was very, very rough on him. But it had its desired effect. It purified all that negative karma. And when Marpa saw that it had that effect, he gave Milarepa all his most precious teachings. Milarepa went into the mountains, meditated, I think it was for 6 years. I might be wrong about the length of time. And by the end of that time, this one-time murderer achieved full enlightenment, meaning not just a bodhisattva, not just a high-level bodhisattva, but the perfection of the entire path. In that same lifetime that he was a murderer. And one sign of his enlightenment was that he spontaneously sang songs of realization. And those songs are still being sung by Tibetans nowadays. He just would spontaneously, they say his throat chakra opened up and he was able to spontaneously give teachings in the form of songs and poems, which still provide the basis for many, many of the teachings practiced today. Right? So he's kind of the way Marpa treated Milarepa is a perfect example of the guru knowing just the precise method that would work for that disciple, even if it's very non-traditional. One little appendix to the story is that afterwards, Marpa told Milarepa, he says, don't treat any of your disciples the way I treated you. Meaning, like, there was a reason I treated you this way. I'm not just a bad-tempered old man. You know, you needed it, but your disciples aren't going to need quite that roughness, so don't do it. And then you see in lamas, you'll have certain lamas who treat some of their disciples very sweetly, very softly, and then they'll turn around and treat other disciples very, very roughly. And it's not a sign that they like one and hate the other. It's a sign of skillful means. That a method, and parents can be like that with children. They love, ideally, they love all their children equally, but certain children need a rougher hand. I'm not talking about physical violence, so they just need a stronger approach, and other children need a harsher approach, a softer approach, and hopefully that difference is not coming from a difference in affection, but a recognition that different methods are more effective for different kids, different adults, different disciples, like that. And then, having done that purification, if one hasn't invoked the power of the resolve beforehand, then at the end would be the time to make the resolution. Now I will avoid that negative action either forever or for some reasonable amount of time. And that just leaves the final element, which is the final element of any virtuous practice, and that is the dedication. So in the same way that if we're performing a purification, we can dedicate the virtue of our positive actions. So now, here in this situation, bringing this particular teaching to a close, we can think, well, if there's been any value in this recitation of the way in which the application of the four opponent powers can reduce the strength of negative karma, then may we dedicate that positive energy, anything that we've generated in our minds, either individually or collectively, trying to keep in mind as best we can that ourselves as the person making the dedication, the act of dedicating, and the recipients of the dedication, the object or the aim of the dedication, none of these three spheres has even one atom of concrete self-existence, but all is a mere dependent arising. To whatever extent that we can keep that realization in mind, then we can make the dedication, may all beings be released from their mental and physical sufferings. fully qualified teachers such as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Kebje Sopa Rinpoche, and many others, both inside and outside the Buddhist fold, revealing true paths to happiness, higher rebirth, liberation, and full enlightenment, may be endowed with long and fruitful lifetimes for the benefit of many. And may we ourselves, as a result of this virtue, come under the benevolent care of such compassionate gurus in this and all future states of existence. May the Buddhas inhabiting every corner of the universe continue to turn the peerless wheel of the Dharma, and may we complete our spiritual path to enlightenment as swiftly and fully as possible in order to repay the infinite kindness we've received from each and every being. And if, through faults of memory or explanation, some of the things that were said here today did not accord with the intention of our perfect gurus, then may those mistakes leave no lasting impression on our mind. But if some of the things are an accurate representation of their teachings, may this take hold and become second nature in our consciousness.